Now, this week sees the release of a British film called 71, which is directed by Yann Damange, and he's, I think, a first-time debut director for a feature film. I think he's been involved in TV up until now. And it stars Jack O'Connell, who's one of my favourite up-and-coming British actors, and it's about the troubles in Northern Ireland, which was the euphemism given to what would lead to a lot of mainland terrorism and also brutality on the streets of places like Ulster and Belfast, with both sides trading enormous amounts of brutality, the IRA mainly on one side, for a reunited Ireland and a Catholic population, which was around a third of the Northern Ireland population. And on the other side, the RUC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the main police force there, who were often mired in a lot of unseemly acts and brutality. The British Army were there as well. And there were also the loyalist terror groups as well that would also be fighting against, like the Ulster Defence Force and so on. This is the RUC with the police. I think I called the Ulster Defence Force the police, the Royal Ulster Constabulary. And it all sort of really came about, it all sort of congealed all these many decades going back to the early 1900s of this Irish opposition to Northern Ireland, which was basically carved out of Ireland and given to the large British population. Very similar in some way to what happened in Ukraine and with Crimea. The majority of the population were very loyal to Britain and thought themselves British, and about a third of the population weren't. But after they were loyal to England during the First World War, I think Winston Churchill and a few others got together and basically gave this part of Ireland to a British Ireland, which was Northern Ireland, as a thank you. And from that point on, there had been quite a rarity in a major European environment, which is a war zone in an urban city, which was definitely the case in places like Ulster and Belfast, where one side of the road would be Catholic and the other side would be Protestant, and there would be this enormous animosity, riots, Molotov cocktails, murders, kidnappings, terrorist bombings. It dominated the 1970s for Britain politically, I feel. And I noticed America was actually quite supportive of the IRA there as well. Never were they called terrorists by American politicians. They were always sort of freedom fighters to them back then. And it follows a brand new English squaddie who gets stationed in Belfast. First time he's ever been away from the barracks. And the first time they go out, they get into this horrible riot that blows up, beautifully well filmed, really quite scary. And he gets separated from the rest of the platoon who flee. And he's violently beaten, and the other guy with him is actually shot. And from that point on, he has a sort of dark journey through the night as he tries to survive on the streets of Belfast, with lots of very interesting story elements along the way. There are times where he's got no friends due to things that he's witnessed, in particular with the Protestant terrorists that he accidentally meets up with, who are on his side but aren't happy that he's actually witnessed the fact that some of the prominent members of the British military are actually with them and what they're about to do. So he ends up with virtually no friends at all. Now, Jack O'Connell I love. He came about in This Is England, but more notably in a sadly unseen and torturous film called Eden Lake, which also has... I knew I'd forget his name. It's got both Jack O'Connell and the guy that starred in Shame and Prometheus and just about everything else, the X-Men. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but a brilliant actor, Michael Fassbender. So that was two great people to get in that film at an early start. And that was horrifying. And Jack O'Connell, who's was most known back then as a star of the TV series Skins, was awful in it. He was so mean and so malevolent and scary. And since then, he's also repeated the trick in the very undervalued Harry Brown with Michael Caine, and also starred up a brilliant film from a year or two ago where he played a prisoner opposite his dad, Ben Mendelsohn, yet again. And that was a searing performance. He was magnificent in that. And he's just had this live wire presence throughout. This film is stylistically like watching a very high quality version of a 1970s British crime drama, with much more explosive action and much more violence and extreme stuff going on. But they get the feel of everything so good, particularly all of the shadowy forces that roam around in the night trying to manipulate one side or the other, always heavy drinking, got the great hairstyles. Stylistically, it's a brilliant film. Unfortunately for me, it's getting 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, which indicates universal acclaim, and it isn't up there. It is a little inconsequential. By the time I got to the end, I kind of felt like I was watching any number of fairly low-rent British thrillers of a similar variety, where the lead character goes through hell and is just basically dragged through hell backwards, and that's basically the whole film. I thought it was a real shame that they didn't focus much more on character interaction, because it's got a great cast. Sean Harris, Sam Reed, Charlie Murphy, Richard Dormer, a lot of people that you would probably not know the name of, but would instantly recognise from other films and other TV shows. And they all have a lot of credibility. The cast is really credible. The people that play the Irish, the Catholic side of it as well are equally good. And the scenes where they've got rioting and stuff going on is pretty terrifying, actually. And you do wonder how anyone could ever really win in that situation. It's just torture to watch. There is some beautiful cinematography, but the thing I thought spoilt it was there's too much of the action and too much of the running down alleyways, too much of them having standoffs or hiding. And when they're talking, I thought the film really came alive, and I was fascinated by these different elements. The British Army were always accused of helping the Protestant terrorists, and Sinn Féin and the other political groups in Ireland helping the Catholic terrorists, and atrocities being committed. And I wanted to know about this, whereas I thought just following someone running down alleyway after alleyway kind of weakened my appreciation for it. It's still a very good film, but erring on good rather than very good. So I'm going to give 71, which is well worth a once through, but perhaps less than the sum of its parts. 7 out of 10. Not the 10 out of 10 it's currently getting on Rotten Tomatoes. Here's a long, languorous track.